I had a friend suggest that the oversized pencil in the last video would make a cool looking lamp. I couldn't get it out of my head. What if I used acrylic between the layers of the hexagon? This would allow me to light the pencil from the inside, and if I played my cards right, it wouldn't be a lot of extra work. But sometimes things don't work out exactly like you plan, and you just have to play it by ear.
Okay, that was bad.
So let's get into the build. First thing I needed to do was set the saw at 60 degrees. That way every piece would be 30 degrees on each side, and when glued together, we'd have that 60-degree angle we're looking for. So here was my test piece with 2-part epoxy. It wound up gluing together pretty good. So I decided this would be the way to go. And I thought the way to make this easy would be to let the plexiglass stick out a little bit on the outside, paint the whole thing, and then scrape across the plexiglass to remove that section. This would make the line perfect and be pretty easy to do. Next step, figure out how wide to cut the acrylic and then start the cutting. I tried to score it and snap it off at first, but I wasn't getting the clean edge I was looking for. Since I had 6 of these to do, I might as well go to plan B. I've had this discontinued mini grizzly track saw. It didn't cut real well in wood, but it was perfect for this. I had been trying to figure out a good way to hold this. I still wanted the plexiglass a little proud of the wood, so I came up with this idea. The idea was to be able to put wedges in the bottom to center everything up, and I thought this would work perfectly. But while test fitting it, the reality set in that this wasn't going to work good at all. I'll probably save these. Maybe they'll be good for something.
Ringer!
I needed to cut some shims the thickness of the plexiglass. That way I could use it for the eraser section and also the pencil sharpened section that you'd find at the bottom. The reality of how messy this glue up was going to be, it really began to set in right here. I found some craft paper to put down and it seemed to work pretty good. After cutting some new jigs to glue this with and forgetting to turn the camera on to film them, you can see here how I'm trying to do it. Putting epoxy down one edge, lay the acrylic, put epoxy down the other edge, and then stick them together. This was definitely not the easiest process and needs some refining. You can tell by the excitement in my voice how well this actually worked.
It's not terrible. It's not good. It's not terrible.
So doing this left quite a bit to clean up, and I was still going to have to glue these 3 sections together. I probably should have cut the excess off these before I glued them. So here I am after the first glue up, cutting them off to try to make it easier for the subsequent glue ups. I realized at this point I was going to have to glue all of these together for the final glue up. At one point I was going to try to do them in 2 separate sections, but there was simply no way. One of the hardest things was trying to get the acrylic to align to the outside of this. The slickness of the epoxy and just the general handling of it made the acrylic want to locate and slide to the inside of this glue up. Even though the acrylic didn't really protrude like I had hoped, it wound up gluing up pretty solid. Using a card scraper here really made this cleanup a lot easier. Now it was time to make the eraser, and I needed some thin strips the thickness of the acrylic. If not using acrylic, this is actually the ideal way to do this. You basically just lay this thing out on some tape, put glue in the joints, and then roll it up. To figure out exactly how I needed to cut the lead, I put some tape on the end of this and got the depression from it, and then I moved it over to the walnut so I could use that to cut. This wasn't perfect, but neither was the body after the glue up. For the sharpen section, I wanted a 15-degree angle, so I went with a 30 on the miter and a 45 block attached to that. I made a few test cuts here to see how deep I needed to put the lead. I didn't actually record me gluing the lead in, but here you can see it going in. And right here, I wanted to put the label on the side of the pencil. This was kind of sketchy. I actually wound up making a fixture for this, and it worked fine. If I were to do this again, I would make this jig way wider. My thumb was about 3 inches from the blade, so it wasn't that big of a deal, but making the triangle bigger is a no-brainer. Now to clean everything up and start on the eraser section. I left this long because originally I wanted the lamp part to be a cap eraser. As I progressed on this thing, it seemed like there were going to be a whole lot of challenges for me to do that. So in the middle of this, I kind of came up with the idea for the acrylic and ordered it while I was working on this. You'll see where that comes into play in a little bit. This is another place where things got really tricky for me. I wanted a simple base. When I came up with the idea, I drew a few different variations of it and even cut one, but I didn't like how it looked. And then from there, I frantically designed quite a few until I finally found something I liked. I drew this up in layers and added dowels for easy alignment. I wound up gluing everything except for the outside on this. I wanted to be able to remove it if I needed to make some changes. When I decided after the fact that the pipe would actually need to go through the lead, this posed a challenge, and the only way I could think to make this work was to saw the end of this off flat. That way I'd have a section where I could start a drill bit. Had I known this before I glued this, I could have drilled this with the drill press. But instead, I get to test exactly how straight I can drill a hole just by sight. Which was surprisingly not bad. I had no idea how to glue metal to wood, so I decided to try some CA glue. Also decided to add some thin walnut where there was chip out. In typical fashion of me trying to keep things perfectly scaled, I had to put a little bevel on this fake blade. Now was the moment of truth. I wanted this to center in the hole. Also wanted this to go far enough in to kind of hide the pipe. Here I drilled a hole in the pipe, that way I could pass the wire through. And then cleaned off any remaining burrs. One thing I noticed when I test fit this is that it stuck up a little too far. I decided to move the pipe flange to the bottom layer. This would fix the problem. In order to center and align the Forstner bit, since there was already a hole there, I just made a template and used it to center the Forstner bit. Then freehand routed where the body of the flange would be. This isn't going to be seen, so it's not a high precision operation here. I decided I wanted the base to look like a piece of old school college rule paper. I needed it flat enough to look like paper, but still be able to route the wires underneath it. So I added one layer to the bottom, that way it would leave a little space for the wires. Once the glue dries, old trusty, sand, sand, sand. Then when I was sure everything would work, I glued the final piece onto the pencil sharpener. I wanted these to be fairly smooth, so I hit them with a little primer. The camera actually felt like I felt having to go outside and paint this. When it's time to paint the pencil, I just mask off the bottom to make it easier for cleanup. Since my acrylic didn't hang out like I was hoping it would, I wound up having to mask the acrylic. This was not easy or ideal. I laid the edge down the acrylic, then very carefully took a box cutter blade and cut this. Luckily, there were a few days here and there that were favorable for spray painting. So when they happened, I needed to take full advantage of it. This actually worked better than I expected. The tape peeled off pretty easy and the lines were crisp. For added protection, I just sprayed lacquer over the whole thing. Remember earlier when I said I ordered acrylic? Well, here it is. I no longer was going to have a cap eraser as a lampshade. I decided that the metal part that holds the eraser was going to be the lamp itself. I wasn't sure if I needed to dissipate the heat from the inside, but I did know I wanted to be able to remove the LEDs in case I wanted to update them. So I wound up ripping this piece of channel down and deburring the edges. This would become the platform for the LEDs. I went with the neon style LED and I just trimmed the brackets down to fit inside the C channel. To mount them, I just drilled the hole, put the screw in, and then ground the back off to make it flush. Next, it was time to shape the eraser. Be sure to support your work. To this, I did what I should have done at first and grabbed a piece of scrap to support it. Now it looked all eraser-like. I did want to leave the hole in the top of this one just to dissipate heat from the LEDs. I didn't really know how to cut this, so I used a coping saw to do it. I bought some blades for my hacksaw to do it, but I lost them and then found them while I was recording this. Since pencils are stamped, I decided I'd just use black CA glue on this. This wound up being a real pain. I mean, I made a mess of it, but I got it done. As for the metal part of the pencil, which would be kind of the lamp, I wanted to obscure this, so I took sandpaper to the inside and outside of it, making sure to go in a horizontal rotation, that way it matched. At this point in the project, I was totally winging it day by day. I had no real idea of how I was going to get this done. But I did make a round gasket that I knew that the acrylic would slide over and that this would be perfect for this pencil. Now all I had to do was mount another one to the eraser That way they would all just friction fit and stick together. I decided I needed a small transition piece between the C channel and the top of the pencil. That would hold it in place so that it didn't just wiggle around in there. Much to my surprise, this didn't take a whole lot of tweaking to get to work. So all I had to do was fit it in the channel and put some screws in it. When I finally decided I wasn't going to try to put a separate bulb at the top, I finally landed on a plan to use kind of a scaffolding that the LED strip could attach to. Since they're individually controlled, I could technically have the top a color and the bottom a color, but that's way above my pay grade. When I cut the smiley face looking piece on the CNC, I left holes for heat dissipation, and also the LED strip needed to come up through it. Now comes some overkill. I decided I wanted to put tape on the outside of this in a pattern and sand around it. That way maybe it would kind of show like a pencil, where part of it was shiny and part of it was dull. Even though it kind of worked, it definitely wasn't worth the effort. You can see it pretty well here, but it doesn't really come through when it's assembled. Now to test fit the inner LED structure. I actually folded the end over on this off camera. The reason for the bend is so that I can screw it in from the top and it doesn't just shake around. I marked this to recess it on the pencil a little bit, even though I could have just notched out that friction fit gasket at the top. Next, I centered what I'll call the light scaffolding and drilled some holes, that way I could screw it into the pencil. I cannot stress how satisfying this part was.
Moment of truth. Yes. Now, will it work? It works.
After clipping the LEDs onto the aluminum channel, all that was needed was to pull the wire through the lead. Then I marked the cut point on the LED strip while the light was on, unplugged it, and then cut through it.
Okay.
Now we had a proper LED light bar. After calculating what the spacing of scaled college rule paper would be, I went ahead and taped it off and then found some acrylic paints laying around the house to paint the lines. The OCD section in my brain wanted this to center. The engineering section in my brain wanted this to scale perfectly. So here's a question. What bothers you more, when something doesn't follow a pattern or when an image is skewed? For me, B overrides A every time. I originally was going to have the wire come out of the center of this, but since the LED strip was pre-wired, it just made it easier to drill a hole beside it. The wire from the LED comes through the pipe into the pencil sharpener base. In the pencil sharpener is the actual switch, but it is a remote controlled unit, so I didn't leave it exposed there. I wanted to round this over a little bit before I spray painted it, but it slipped my mind, so I had to backtrack right here. One last thing I wanted to do was give this more definition around the ferrule. So I drew up the shadow lines of it and convinced my wife to do it on her silhouette so I could just do this in vinyl. It was kind of tricky rolling this around in one take. I had to be very careful that it aligned, but it actually worked pretty well. But that's enough talking. Let's see how this looks. So a few things I learned on this project. If I was going to mount acrylic to wood again, I would probably buy some clear acrylic rods and use them like dowels to center it. That way it didn't get pushed around by the two-part epoxy. It's hard to sandwich it between there. I think this turned out good, but it looks even better with the lights off. I really like these individually controlled LED strips. You can do some cool things with them. The chaser lights and the gradients and stuff, it just makes for a cool design. During this process, I reached out to the LED and WLED subreddit. I truly appreciate the feedback I got from those. It at least gave me an idea of what I needed to do. I hope you enjoyed the build, and if you have any suggestions, feel free to let me know in the comments. I've got some really cool projects planned for this year. These are projects you won't want to miss. So as usual, if you made it this far in the video, like and subscribe.
Okay, that was bad.